I'm Gavin Chuck. I'm the executive director of Alarm of Sound. And I want to start by introducing the panelists today. I want to introduce John Rowden. He's the senior director of Bird-Friendly Communities, which is a title I love, a title that could only exist in an institution like the Audubon Society. John, would you maybe just say a little bit about what that title means and what bird-friendly communities means?
Sure. Thanks, Gavin, and welcome everybody. It's great to be here. So bird-friendly communities is one of Audubon's 5 conservation strategies, which focuses on the birds in the communities that we share with them. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that when we get into the panel discussion, but I support our network of over 450 chapters around the country. We have nature centers and state offices in a variety of states. And so that Audubon is a fantastic place to work in the sense that we get to connect with people all over the country and help protect birds and communities. So I'm very lucky.
Brooke Bateman is joining us. She's the director of climate science at Audubon Society. And Brooke, I wonder if you could just tell us briefly about your work.
Yeah, thank you also for inviting me here today. So as the director of climate science, I work on all of our climate science within the initiative, the climate strategy within Audubon. So really understanding how climate change affects birds and the places that birds use, both now and into the future with climate change. So pretty broad scope, but yeah, happy to be here to talk about this today.
We also have with us Alan Pierson, who is the artistic director of Alarm of Sound. Alan, please introduce yourself and talk about what being the artistic director is.
Yeah, so hey everybody, I'm the artistic director and conductor of Alarm Will Sound. And Alarm Will Sound is a collaborative group of 16 musicians, plus me as the conductor and Gavin as the executive director and a handful of other staff folks. And as the artistic director, it's my job to lead this collaborative team in making all sorts of contemporary art that engages with the world that we live in. And my role in this project is a little unusual compared to what I usually do, since, and I know we'll talk about this, there's no conductor in this piece that John's created for us. And usually I'm both the artistic director behind the scenes and then also on stage with the ensemble as the conductor. And this is a piece that engages me in a slightly different way that has been super interesting as an artist.
And finally, I want to welcome John Luther Adams, the composer of the piece. John, please introduce yourself and talk about what composing this piece for you is about.
It's a pleasure to be with all of them. I'm very interested to hear more about the work that Brooke and John are doing with Audubon. Yes, I'm a composer. This is what I do. It's what I've known I was going to do with my life since I was about 15. But in a very real sense, my life's work began with birds. At the tender age of 21, I became captivated by the music of a particular bird. I didn't know its name. I was living in an old farmhouse in Georgia, in rural Georgia, and every morning and again at dusk, I would go out in the woods and just sit and listen to these magical sounds. And eventually I began to try to write down, to transcribe some of what I was hearing and feeling. And in time, I came to discover that this was the music of the wood thrush. And it turns out that the wood thrush was the favorite singer of the man whom, perhaps more than anyone else, set the course of my life, and that is Henry David Thoreau. And so I began working on a set of pieces, a set of miniatures for piccolos and percussion instruments called songbird songs with a lowercase s. And you know, over the last, how long ago was that? A long time ago. My work, over the decades, my work has led me in all over the map, both geographically, metaphorically, and musically. But I always seem to come back to birds. And even now, living in a new environment, I'm constantly trying to write down the songs that the birds learn. As Annie Dillard says in Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, learn the strange syllables one by one. So from songbird songs to 10,000 birds.
And I should mention that 10,000 Birds was commissioned by Alarm of Sound. And again, just to actually repeat what I've and all of us in Alarm of Sound have said, which is to thank you, John, for writing this piece for us. Alan, I've heard you tell this story so many times. It's a great story. I'd love for you to tell the story of what it was to receive those written down bird songs from John.
Yeah, that's really what it was. And so what's interesting about 10,000 Birds, or there are many things interesting about 10,000 Birds. So the one I'll talk about right now is how different it is from any other piece that Alarm Will Sound has ever commissioned. Generally when we get a piece from a composer, it comes with a beginning and a middle and an end, and it tells the score tells all of us what we're going to do during the course of this arc that takes us from beginning to middle and end. And John, I don't remember now if I had any advance heads up about this, but I don't remember that I did. And I think my recollection, which could be wrong, is that we were so excited you were writing this piece for us. And I knew, of course, about your long history with birdsong. And so I knew you were writing a piece for us that was going to be connected to that, which was very exciting. But I think somehow I was unprepared for what a puzzle it was that you delivered.
I think I may have sneaked up on you. I don't remember exactly, but I may have had in mind doing something that was more beginning, middle, end, more conventionally structured through composed, which is, of course, the way most of my music is composed. But, going back to those very first pieces, the songbird songs that I mentioned, I had already, at the age of 21, I had realized, well, no, this isn't, I don't want this to be a story about birds. I don't want this to be I want it to be more like the experience of hearing birds in the world. And you never quite know who's going to sing next or where they're going to be.
Right.
And so I had this idea of composing with bird songs in a loose leaf format and providing some general suggestions about how things might be put together. I think of this as a folio, or sometimes call it a performance kit. So it's like a backpack full of bird songs. And I give you the backpack and you put it on your shoulders and I say, have a great trip.
Right. Well, I remember my first reaction was like, oh man, this backpack's really heavy. How do I lift
a lot of
this
birds.
backpack? What do I do with it? There's so much stuff. And, the first reaction was like, oh my God, this is a lot that I have to take on to figure out, okay, so this is all this wonderful material. How do we shape an evening with it? And I remember I had a conversation with you, John, and I made a first attempt at that. And I shared it with you, and John was like, "This isn't feeling right yet." And then you suggested the idea that it should be based around a cycle of a day. And I think I initially was thinking harmonically, I try to organize the songs in a harmonic way.
Right.
You were like, "No, I think we should structure this so that the performance begins with, morning songs, and then goes into midday and afternoon songs, and then evening songs, and then there's a whole nighttime section which is focused on the frogs, and then it's a cycle, so we come out the other side and it's morning again." And I was like, oh, okay, well, that sounds like a great idea. Question, which of these songs are morning songs? I don't know.
I remember this now.
Before I go work on this. And then you talked that through with me. And then I went off again and made a second attempt at a structure for the piece, and you were super supportive of it. And then we got together in St. Louis and had this initial workshop process where we sort of put this thing on its legs, and there was a general plan that I had worked up of at what time in the piece everything would happen and where the players would be when they played each of the songs. And then we workshopped it together. And it's a structure that, and I really love this about the experience of the piece, that I think attempts to balance. John, you said something really lovely a few minutes ago about the element of surprise, like walking into the world and encountering a bird unexpectedly. And there is that in the piece. Like the piece, I think, tries to give that sense of surprise, but then there also is a feeling of structure to it. And there is a degree to which we have planned out the sequence of events and where the players will be. And there's a sort of shape to the whole event as it goes from the sounds of morning through the day into the sounds of evening and night.
And you hit on something that's really essential, not only to this piece, but really more and more to all of my music, including my symphonic pieces, my concert hall pieces. Not only when do we hear things, but where are they when we hear them?
The piece is in many ways kind of like an installation. So we're performing these in an outdoor space, and it's not in an orchestra formation. We're not sitting down like you would see an orchestra. In fact, the players are spread out among the space, and the audience is moving around the space as they want. And so in many ways, actually, the way that we perform it is very much like what you said, John. It's as if you're taking a walk, a nature walk, and you encounter a mourning dove except instead of a mourning dove, it's a clarinet.
And each individual listener's experience of this piece is unique. Of course, that's true even when two of us go into the concert hall and hear the same string quartet performed, but much more so in a case like this, because it's not only composed for in an open form for the musicians, it's for free range audience, right? So people are you can have a beautiful experience of this piece by rooting yourself in one location and just letting the birds fly around you and sing all around. But many people choose to follow their ears and trace their own pathway through the physical space of the music, which delights me. And not to put too fine a point on it, or too broad a point on it, but that's the kind of society I want to live in. And I think if we lived in a society in which each one of us as individuals felt more fully responsible for our own place in the world, our own experience in the world, and our own contribution to the experience of community, of being together in a place, I think problems like climate change would be dealt with much more effectively than they're dealt with at present, because as a culture we would insist on it. So for me, especially a piece like 10,000 Birds and other of my outdoor pieces, they're kind of a model of not only an ecologically conceived music, but also a kind of model of the society that I would like to live in.
Yeah, and you just mentioned the word community in what you just talked about. And as we talked about right at the beginning, that John Rowden, your title includes community. And in fact, one thing I love about this particular piece is the sense of community that it builds, and that it's a human meets nature community. That sounds like it's at the heart of what you do, John Rowden. And I wonder what you could say about that, and based on also what you've heard the musicians here talk about.
Thinking about bird-friendly communities, well, the kind of paradigm that we operate under is that we're working to provide birds with the things they need in the communities that we share with them. And there's, we think of that scientifically, things like food and shelter and safe passage and places to raise young. But we also just think about it from the standpoint of, if we're providing the things that birds need in our community, we're making them better for birds, and we're also making them better for people, because we all do form this community together. And if it needs to be said, right, birds are, the non-human, non-domestic animals that we connect with most, just because they're around us all the time. And I was thinking as you were having that discussion, part of the, the joy of going out and seeing birds or going birding is the joy of the unexpected. You don't know what you're going to get, but you always get something, right? And it's so, I mean, I have to own that statement. I always get something. I know that everybody's experience is different. But just, yeah, thinking about the communities and, when, if we're doing things like creating green space that's full of native plants that provide the resources that birds need, that makes our communities better for people too. People can have access to green spaces, and we have to think about the equity of that access to that, across species and within our own species. We think about, birds migrate at night largely. Most of our North American birds, about 80%, migrate at night, and we broadcast tremendous amounts of light into the sky at night artificially, and that can be problematic for birds. But also thinking there's consequences to human health and attachment to our own cultural heritage by these massive amounts of light in the sky. And so I think that there's just so many connection points between how we think about how do we actually take this environment that we share with birds, make that better for them, and we just benefit from that consistently and constantly.
One thing that is an interesting kind of resonance between the broader things that you just talked about, John, and the way that we perform this piece is that what I've noticed is that, like, purely from an acoustic point of view, the most successful places to perform this is in an environment that's not completely natural, that has some kind of human-built environment. That comes down to just the acoustics of sound bouncing off. Let's say if we're in a courtyard where there's maybe a building or two buildings on the side that's open to nature. So there's some green space and there's some human built environment, and the sound bounces off of that. Whereas if we were just in an open park, it doesn't quite reflect in the same way. And that has always underlined for me, on an aesthetic basis, just like it sounds better, how this piece points to this human nature contact that is really about humans meeting birds. And John, John Luther Adams, you've seen your pieces performed in a wide range of those kinds of settings, from completely natural. I know that through friends of ours that some pieces have been performed out in the tundra, and you've seen them in built environments. And I wonder if you can just talk about that range of experiences and maybe reflect on what I just said, which is my experience of having produced these in partially built environments.
Yeah, I share your feeling that this piece works really well in partially built environments. At the same time, I feel as though this piece could work well in any environment where there are humans and birds, that shared community, which is much of the earth, isn't it? I've been making outdoor music for a couple of decades now, and I remember it began consciously with a big percussion piece called Inuksut. It's for up to 99 percussionists to be performed only out of doors. And I've heard it performed in urban environments. I've heard it performed, as you suggested, on the tundra with no one around, and kind of everything in between. And what I've discovered, which goes to your point about acoustics, about the interplay between music and place. I've noticed that these outdoor pieces like topography, they like varied vegetation, and some degree of elevation is a good thing too. Sounds like what birds like, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, also something you're saying, and Alan, actually, you've mentioned this to me in private, and I think it's actually an experience that much of us had over the initial lockdown. Many of us live in urban environments, and in that first 4 weeks of March of 2020, when nothing was happening, birds filled that space, and we heard bird song. And Alan, I know that also inspired you to make a version of 10,000 birds for the pandemic. And can we just recap that and talk a little bit about?
Sure, sure. Well, when lockdown started and all of our concerts got canceled, we all started thinking about like, well, what do we do? And for us, Alarm Will Sound is a large ensemble. There weren't immediately great answers to that. We did some stuff, early on. We heard people like playing on click tracks and would put together like recordings that people made at home, and it was kind of a sad experience, like sitting alone in your room playing some fiendishly hard thing, with your cat meowing and a kid wanting your attention. It's like, it's depressing. Like, making music together is what we do and what we love doing, and we help each other. And it was these were kind of like sad early pandemic experiences. And I was also, I live in Brooklyn. I live here with my partner Paul, and we were so feeling cut off from the natural world. It's hard to remember now because now, like, we just got back from being in the mountains. But I think early on there was this feeling of, God, like, we just need to hunker down here and not go anywhere because the world is dangerous. And so we were like barely going out. We were certainly not seeing anybody. And there was this craving for connection to both, human communities and natural communities, which is what John's music is all about. And somewhere in this, I don't even remember what got me thinking about 10,000 birds, but somehow I had the inspiration to create a version of 10,000 birds here in the apartment, using devices that using like stuff we had on hand, old cell phones, computers, and 10,000 birds is so much about, as Gavin and John will talk about, the experience of surprise encounters with birds, or in this case with instrumentalists being inspired by birds. And I thought, what if we create that here and create a kind of installation around the apartment where different bird songs are placed in different places around the apartment, and then I, as sort of the narrator, like film it with my cell phone and move around the place encountering these various birds that are hiding in the apartment. And no one was that into the idea when I started talking about it. I think, John, you were very unconvinced that this is a good idea.
Well, you know me, Alan. I'm all about being there. About being somewhere and being together. And
Right.
You bounce the idea off of me. And what I recall saying, which is probably not what I said, but I might have said, is Alan, that's a terrible idea. That's an awful idea. It's against everything I and my music stand for. Do it. Because I was missing the same thing you were missing. I was missing making music with other human beings. I was
Yeah.
missing New York, which
Yeah.
is my favorite city in the world. I was missing you and the musicians in Alarm Will Sound. And normally, if you'd come to me with an idea of doing 10,000 screens, I would have said, no way. No, do
Right.
not do that. But I said, go ahead, do it. And I thought, I won't look. I can't look. And then you sent it to me, and of course, I couldn't not look. And I was so touched.
Mhm.
It was just such a beautiful thing. And under maybe it was all about the circumstances, but I thought it turned out to be a brilliant idea. And
No,
you,
thanks, John. Well, I'm very touched. I really appreciate that.
Everything happens in circumstances and in places. One thing that I recall as we prepared for this, Brooke said something which was just, I think, really at the heart of what we're talking about here, which is that birds can tie us to our history, to our circumstance, and to place. In fact, Brooke, you had a really great story about how you became interested in birds. And I wonder if you would share that with the audience.
Yeah, happy to. So birds have always been a part of my life since I was a child. And I really think that birds tie us to particular places, to points in our lives, and to people in our lives. It's just, you often ask people, like, what was that moment that got you into birds? Or what was that spark bird, what we call it in the birding language, I suppose. And people will go back right to like that moment that they heard that bird, who they were with, where they were. It's just really, birds really tie us to our sense of place. So for me, I remember very vividly, I'm from New York, I'm from Long Island. I used to spend my summers in Wisconsin with my grandparents. And around 8 years old, I heard this bird call, and it was just the most haunting, majestic, surreal sound I had ever heard. And my grandmother is an ornithologist. She's really gotten us into birds our whole life. And she explained to me that that's the call of the common loon. And so it was from that moment forward that that bird just sparked me to just love nature, love birds, and put me on this career trajectory where I'm now studying ecology and climate change and birds in general. And the thing that really strikes me about what I do, because I study climate change, is that once I got into this work, I understood that with climate change, there's potential that I could go back to my grandparents' place in Wisconsin and not be able to see that bird anymore because it's no longer going to be the right conditions. It's going to be too hot. And so just thinking about that connection and how it relates to my family, I also have a daughter. And the last time we were in Wisconsin, I brought her to the lake and she got to see and hear the loon. And it's just like being with her in that moment, connecting again, family, place, things that we care about, and then understanding that these things that we care about could potentially just disappear. It really had like a profound impact on me as like a person, but also in my career. So I think it's just really important to like make those connections, and that like birds really are just, they're not just background noise. They really are a way of like pulling us into that sense of place. And I think it's like really interesting to think about with climate change, because we have what we call the soundscape of that place. It's like the instead of the visual landscape, it's the sound, the music of the birds that we hear. Those soundscapes are going to change. Like we're not going to be hearing the same birds we used to, and that's going to really kind of disorient our sense of place. So I think it's just it's interesting how birds and sound can like really pull us to all sorts of really important parts of who we are and where we come from.
You know, and that sense of place and the connection between birds and bird songs and place, I think is so deeply a part of John's work with the piece. And there's a really interesting choice that you made in creating this, John, that I'd be curious to hear you talk more about, which is that we should only play bird songs that could be heard in the places where we're performing the piece. And there have been some wonderful moments. I think, you know, we've talked a lot about the piece as being ideally suited to this, you know, junction between nature and constructed, you know, human environments. And part of what makes that really magical is when in performance there are dialogues where you have like the instruments, and then there also is actual bird song going on. And sometimes it's not clear what's one or what's the other. And those are really magical moments in the performance of the piece.
Yeah, you know, the idea originated, I keep talking about this big percussion piece, the first big outdoor piece, Inuksut. That piece goes through all sorts of apocalyptic events. It's sort of haunted by as a lot of my music is, by the dies irae, the days of thunder that we seem to be bringing on ourselves, wildfires and desertification and rising seas. But at the end of that musical apocalypse in Inuksut, we get bird songs. And that's kind of the moment of resurrection. And I don't know, when I was composing that piece, I knew it was going to be premiered in the Canadian Rockies. But then it started being done all over the world. And every time someone would come to me and say, you know, we want to do it in Brazil, we want to do it in Hong Kong, we want to do it in Denmark, we want to do it in central Mexico, I would say, okay, but I'm going to have to compose some bird songs for you to put at the end of your performance, because it's essential that we be playing the songs of birds that live and sing there. And as you say, Alan, some of the most magical moments are when we hear the same birds being echoed between the human instruments and the birds themselves. So that's part of the magic. And you remember there's this preposterous idea, which is kind of my stock in trade, right? But this outlandishly grandiose idea, which I still cling to, that your 10,000 birds, Alarm Will Sound's 10,000 birds, is the first installment in a global morning chorus. You know, it's always morning somewhere and birds are always singing. And but we began with birds that inhabit the eastern seaboard of the United States, of North America, really, and birds that inhabit the deciduous hardwood forests of the east up to the beginning of the plains, because we knew the premiere, you guys, the ensemble's based in New York, and a lot of your performances would be in the east, but the premiere took place in St. Louis. So that defined the bioregion for me. And I decided, okay, I'm going to work with birds that live and sing in this bioregion.
One thing that you mentioned, Brooke, that makes me think about this piece in 20 years as that soundscape changes. How will the piece relate to that change? And in 20 years, if the migration patterns have changed and a bird no longer exists in a particular place, how we would have to change that, or John, how you would, as you complete this very large vision. I don't know. I don't have a sense, Brooke, and maybe you can speak to this. I don't have a sense of how quickly birds are disappearing or how quickly they're changing. But John, I can imagine that you're writing the piece in a certain time and then it becomes a different thing because birds are changing.
It's called 10,000 birds because that's approximately the number of bird species that exist now on the earth, but it's 10,000 and counting, unfortunately, down.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate. I mean, John, you mentioned the wood thrush is sort of like your inspiration when you're like kind of pull that bird call that you finally figured out what it was. And we've lost 6 out of 10 wood thrush in the last 30, 60 years. There's just less of them in the woods. And then if you look at our science with the projections, they're going to lose a large part of their range, not occur where they used to. And they're highly vulnerable to climate change, as are 2/3 of the other birds that we looked at in North America. So like things are happening fast, and there's going to be a huge change if we don't do something to stabilize climate change now. So, yeah.
I live now in the at 6,000 feet in the northern edge of the Chihuahuan Desert, on the home ground of the Mescalero and Lipan Apache people. And not too far from here last fall, there was a massive die-off. And then in the winter that followed, we had here in our place on the mountain 104 bluebirds mountain bluebirds who spent the winter with us. And no one I could talk to no one around here had ever experienced that. Now this summer, there have been almost no birds around. I have no idea. Maybe Brooke, you and John have some idea of what's going on here, but it's very disconcerting not to hear birds singing.
Yeah, and I'll say for sure, I mean, out west, there's been a particularly hard year in terms of extreme climate events. And that certainly is something tied with climate change. People think of climate change as this like far off future event, but it's not, it's happening now. And I think birds are a really interesting lens to look at climate change because, as John mentioned earlier, they're sort of everywhere, they're our connection to nature. At Audubon, we use this hashtag birds tell us because they really are the messengers. We really see what's going on in the environment through what the birds are doing. And these mass die-off events or birds not showing up anymore are showing that we're having changes in our environment. So it's really an indicator that climate change is happening now, amongst other things that are already causing issues for birds.
Gavin, your question haunts me. I remember years ago I composed a piece called "In the White Silence," which is it's a 75-minute sprawling piece for strings, string orchestra, harp, celeste, percussion, string quartet. It's a love song to the Arctic, and specifically the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which is, for me, like the Holy Land. And a few years after that piece was recorded, someone wrote that Mike Dunham, who was the arts editor for the Anchorage Daily News at that point, said, in 20, 30 years, this piece will be a kind of archaeological record of an Alaska that no longer exists. I'm afraid he was right. And so, Gavin, I don't know what the Alarm Will Sound folio of 10,000 birds will be 20, 30 years from now. Maybe it will be some sort of archaeological or ecological or cultural record. I just don't know what to think about that. But hearing the songs of birds that maybe no longer inhabit a place or maybe are no longer in existence, I think is a very important thing. I've just finished composing a huge piece called Vespers of the Anthropocene, a multi-part piece that is the saddest, most grief-filled music I've ever composed. The central section of it is singing choral music that the text is entirely in Latin. It's the scientific names, the Latin binomials for 100 and some odd critically endangered and threatened species of birds, plants, and other animals. But for me, the saddest moment in the Vespers of the Anthropocene is a 5-minute movement piece called Aria of the Ghost Bird. And it's my attempt to transcribe the voice of the last Kauai o'o, a bird that went extinct, 30, 40 years ago now. There's a recording of the last o'o who was in captivity singing for the mate who would never arrive. And it's just heartbreaking.
That is heartbreaking. And I know how, on the other hand, that the reason the Audubon Society exists and that John, Rowden, and Brooke do the work that they do is because there are opportunities to make change and to act. I come back to this notion of community that has been driving this conversation, and that drives so much of what we do. And so I think of John Rowden, thinking about what next steps or what people can do, or even in this conversation, what may be resonating with you between the relationship between a piece like 10,000 Birds or the work that John Luther Adams does, and how we can slow down extinction or how we can make change. Do you see a connection between art and activism, especially in the work that you do with communities?
Well, the short answer is absolutely. I think that this is a really great opportunity to explore that. And, even harking back to when you were talking about the beginning of the pandemic and people were slowing down and hearing sounds they had never heard before because they had, the background noise, the real background noise had receded and they were slowed down. And my experience, people were coming out of the woodwork, literally connecting with me professionally and personally saying, I'm hearing so many more birds, and that connection to that place. And and I mean, we have metrics around that, right? Like the downloading of our bird ID app just went through the roof because people then wanted to know what it was. And I think that the challenge is, how do we continue to engage those people and show that there are things that they can do and have to do, because we are in a pickle, for lack of a better term, around all of this, and we better get our, I don't know, whatever metaphor, I'm going to go down a bad path, so I'm not going to even do it. But yeah, there are things so I think that one of the great things of thinking about art, the connection of art and science and art and conservation, is that we, like John was talking about earlier, like how do we take our consciousness about this and create a community of consciousness that can actually move the needle. And one of the things that we do, the team that I lead, is to provide ways that people can contribute in whatever kind of patch or space or community they live in and have access to create better situations for themselves and for birds. So I'm going to give a shout out to all of my programs, right? We have a program called Plants for Birds, which seeks to put more of our native plants in the ground, and that will provide better habitat for birds. If we can do that very consistently across the globe, then we can do a better job. We have to provide refugia where birds can find habitat space as they're moving through the landscape, or they're actually coming in for wintering or summering or breeding or whatever. And we can all do that. We can all contribute to that. We can do things like making our places, our communities, safer for birds by making glass apparent to them, because birds don't perceive glass as a barrier, and up to 1 billion birds are killed a year in North America by colliding with glass, right? There's solutions to all of this. Dimming lights at night, all of these things. You can go to audubon.org and you can find out more about that. Again, I can't give, we don't have enough time to talk about all of that, but I would encourage anybody who's listening to know that they do have a place and they do have a role in actually trying to help.
And I know, and I encourage people to go, obviously, to go to the website and take those first steps. I know that you and Brooke bring the lens of a scientist to this. A lot of this conversation has been dominated by us musician side talking about that. And Brooke, I wonder if you see the balance between a sort of the scientific perspective that you have and hearing what we've been talking about as musicians, and how that maybe has an effect on how you bring your work into the world.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, I am a scientist by my job, but I deeply care about these things. And I think from what I've understood about, like, especially climate change in general, which is like a tricky topic to talk about. The first thing is that we need to talk about it more, but we also need to come to people and connect with people in a way that they're going to meet you there. And so it's not always like the facts and the science and the hard information that gets people drawn in. It's connecting to people through their hearts, through things they care about, through the birds in their communities. Or art is a wonderful way to connect people and bring people in. I mean, Audubon has the Audubon mural project, where they're trying to highlight all of the climate vulnerable bird species, and these beautiful murals across New York City, where artists are coming in and interpreting that bird species the way they want to. And it's grabbing people's attention and bringing them into the conversation about climate change, which, again, that's that first piece, like getting people to talk about climate change and connecting to them where they care. So I think that there's definitely a place for science, because we need to know the facts, but we also need to be able to connect with people so that we can get people to take actions and move the needle and really make a difference with what we're trying to do here.
And music is, of course, all about moving people. It's motion and emotion. And I think, John, I want to give you the last word here to talk about motion, emotion, music, nature, all of these big things that we've been talking about, because I know it so much underlies your work, not only in this piece, but your work in general.
Thank you, Gavin. Listening to you, Brooke, and listening to you, John, I'm reminded that the best scientists are every bit as creative as artists. The reason that I've given my life to music, I started out early on, actually through Audubon. I was an environmental activist in my 20s and 30s before I rededicated myself to my work as a composer. But I think we're all confronted these days with these overwhelming questions, and each one of us is in the face of these questions and these dark clouds on our collective horizon. We're each one of us asking ourselves, what's the best thing that I can do? And of course, the answer is different for each one of us. But for me, leaving activism and rededicating myself to art was rededicating myself to creative thought and embracing mystery, which I think is what the best science does also. A good scientist will tell you, well, we don't really know. And that's what keeps us going as scientists, as artists, as thinking animals, as fully alive human beings, is embracing the incredible mystery of life and the possibility of discovery. That's why I do what I do, and I know it's why my colleagues in this panel do what they do with their lives. And I think if we're all in this together, and as David Brower once said, searching for answers to questions we haven't yet learned to ask. That's what it's about. What keeps me going day to day, what gets me up every morning and sends me over to my studio with a sense of renewed dedication, of purpose, and conviction, is my love for and my faith in the next generations, the young people who are going to have to sort through the rubble that my generation is leaving them and imagine new ways of living together with one another and with all other species of life on this miraculous planet that, for most of us, is the only home we will ever know.
Yeah. Well, I think some of that work has been done, and I'm sharing in the chat right now a link to a report, Survival by Degrees, on the Audubon website. But to end on a note of what people can do, I wonder, Brooke, if you can talk about Survival by Degrees.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So Survival by Degrees was a report we put out, I think a little over a year, 2 years ago now, which is looking at how birds are going to be affected by climate change in North America. And I mentioned this earlier, but we looked across over 600 species, and we found that 2/3 of them are at risk of potential extinction and large amounts of range loss because of climate change, particularly if we don't do anything to stabilize climate change. The good news is that our science showed that if we did take action, pulling greenhouse gas emissions out of the atmosphere, stabilizing climate change, that 76% of those species will be better off. They'll see less range loss, when that means that they won't have to move as far, they won't disappear from the areas that they're currently occurring in. So it really is like a call to action that we need to take steps to do something about climate change. And that can mean working on policy and becoming an activist. The magazine, Audubon magazine, put together a fantastic call to action, and we could probably post the link in there of like certain steps you can do. And one of them, like I said, was starting the conversation. But the science is there. It's really cool. You can go into like your zip code and look at your state and look at like how the birds are potentially going to be affected in your area. And you can understand if like your favorite bird might be affected by climate change. We also just recently put out a different report called the Natural Climate Solutions Report, which is kind of part of the solution. And a lot of what John does is part of the solution. It's getting out there, it's planting native plants, reforesting areas, getting out there and restoring habitats, because those sort of have this like win-win in the fact that they create habitats for birds, they improve habitats for people, but they also pull that carbon, those greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere and lock it in like the plants. And so that's one step that we can take to both benefiting birds and people and climate change action. So there's a lot of information there, but the really hopeful part of the science for me is that if we take these actions, we really can make a difference. It's just we need to start now, because it's getting to the point where we need to take action, or it's going to be a little bit too late.
Is there anything else anyone on the panel wanted to add in the last few minutes before we end in 5 minutes?
I have a question for John. John, I've never asked you this before, and I've always been curious about it. Something that really interests me in what you've done in 10,000 Birds is I've gotten to know the music and gotten to know the bird songs. Is some of them are very literal. There's some bird songs where you can really like go listen to, go to the Cornell website and listen to like their recording of the bird, and you can see, oh yeah, I can hear exactly what John did with that. And then others that are much more abstract, where the relationship seems much more impressionistic and much less obvious. And I'm curious about what, for any particular bird, what would draw you in one of those directions or another?
That's actually a great question. No one's ever asked me that before. And the truth is, I'm not sure, Alan. It may be my own limitations, technically, but some of it also, because some bird songs are easy to write down, to transcribe more or less, and others are incredibly difficult and elusive. Thrushes have two syrinxes. Everything they sing is multiphonics. And I thought about writing some of the woodwind parts for 10,000 Birds and other pieces as multiphonics, and I thought, no, that'll make it too much like contemporary music,
right.
New music.
Right.
It'll call attention to itself rather than creating this place. So that may be part of it.
And for those who don't know, multiphonics they're kind of unusual techniques that you can use on woodwind instruments to make them play two notes at once. And they're very cool. They're gorgeous.
They're fantastic.
Yeah.
But I didn't want this music to be about that. I wanted it to be about something else. We're talking about spark birds. The wood thrush was the one who started it all for me, and one of the great singers of the world, not just North America. And for me, that is the voice of the eastern hardwood forest. The bird that I want to hear, the bird song I want to hear on my deathbed, is another thrush. It's the hermit thrush, which is, for me, the voice of summer in the boreal forest. I lived for most of my life in interior Alaska. And then since leaving Alaska, it's now the canyon wren. Because I've lived in Mexico, but both Mexicos, old and new, and I go back and forth all the time. The song of the canyon wren is incredibly beautiful and florid and intricate, and you kind of have to slow it down in order to make anything out of it. Otherwise, it's just sort of a throwaway thing. So a lot of times, yes, I will just slow things down so that they can get inside of them, the more complex songs. But then, a little a white-throated sparrow or a boreal chickadee. These are very, very simple songs, and so I try to leave them as pristine and simple as I possibly can. So we have different voices in the music. I don't know if that really answered your question.
No, that's great. That's very cool. Thank you.
Let me thank you, Alan, Gavin, and all the members of Alarm Will Sound for taking this backpack full of musical possibilities and making it your own. I mean, that is a composer's fondest aspiration for any music we might compose, loose leaf or through composed. You give it to other people and you hope that it will mean something to them and that they will make it their own. That's true for performing musicians, and ultimately the music isn't completed until it enters the ears, the mind, and the heart of a gifted listener. So thank you for taking this piece. Thank you for asking for it. Thank you for taking it to heart, making it your own, and sharing it with other people who hopefully can make it their own.
And it's been such a joy for us.
Yes, thank you. And I want to thank John, Rowden, and Brooke for participating and representing, not only representing the Audubon Society, but really speaking on behalf of birds and speaking on behalf of the community, really. And I want to thank all who attended. You are also part of the community, and we look forward, if you're in the New York City area or you're in Philadelphia, to attending these 2 upcoming concerts. It's an inspiring experience to share, and we look forward to seeing you there or seeing you at any of our upcoming performances. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you all.
Have a good night.